primary reason for masquerading is that it alludes to the hidden aspect of the miracle of Purim, which was disguised by natural events, but was really the work of the Almighty. Oh, so interesting. So it's not about hiding who you were, but more the fact that God, and we definitely have to talk about this, about how God is not named in this at all. But
Right.
the idea or the assumption, if you read it, is that some of the things that just happen or the things that are maybe influenced by God. In particular, the one that particularly stood out for me was when Xerxes or Ahasuerus has that where he can't sleep. He's disturbed by something. It kind of feels like a poking.
Mm-hmm. A divine poke.
Probably we should get into this. Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome to the end of May, one and all. We are here today with a lovely little spring story for you. The story of Esther. What a cute little story this is.
After dealing with all these like massive books and massive sets of writings like the Torah or the Deuteronomistic history or the Chronicler, it's nice to have one little discrete story.
Yeah. Kind of like Ruth. Only this one's a lot bloodier.
And
I think I kind of forgot how bloody it was because I did read this to my son out of one of his children's Bibles. I have one that's the Bible app for kids, Storybook Bible. So I know we've mentioned before that the Bible app and recommended that as one way you can access the Bible. They have a version for kids, bible.com/kids. They also have a printed book that you can read. And I used to read this story to my son, and I'd forgotten that it still talks about the death, not quite as graphically as this one does, but
Leaves that out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it says that people die, but it doesn't, get into
The long pole.
They don't really get into exactly what kind of a gallows we're dealing with here. And it skips over the part with, it really only deals with Haman and not the rest of his family.
That would be a nice way of doing it.
Yeah. It's, it's the brave and beautiful queen. Doesn't that sound like a lovely, sweet story to read?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So the book itself, not the Bible app version for children, but the actual text we think was from the late Persian period, 3rd to 4th century BCE, or actually 4th to 3rd century BCE. You go backwards when you get to BCE.
Yeah.
And
a little bit after Ezra and Nehemiah, maybe.
Right. So this is
after or before.
So this is after the Babylonians take away everyone to Babylon, the destruction, and after Persia comes and defeats Babylon, but before the people go back to Jerusalem. So this is probably written by a Jewish community living in the Persian Empire that had formerly been the Babylonian Empire. And we really think that not just because of the content of the book, but also because of how the book is written. It seems to have like some really detailed items on how Persians lived back then that you might not have known if it was, being written 100 years later. It also has what we call Persian loan words. So these people, living in a foreign land when other languages are being spoken, it seems like they are like taking in some of these other words and they're including them in the Hebrew text. So every once in a while, the Hebrew will sort of stop and there'll be a Hebrew transliteration of what's called of an old Persian word. My favorite is in chapter 1, verse 5. It talks about the king's palace garden. And that word for garden there is not a Hebrew word. It's an old Persian word. It's paradisa. And this old Persian word actually becomes the root for our English word paradise. This is one of the places where we come to understand the Garden of Eden as a paradise. It is not called paradise in the book of Genesis, but here this garden is called a paradise, and so that kind of gets kicked back on over to the Garden of
I know I
Eden.
like to be in the garden, and it does feel sometimes like being in paradise when you're in a nice garden.
Yeah, especially in May.
Especially in May.
Yeah.
Things are really blooming.
So one of the interesting things about this book is, and it's one of like the famous things, like if you know like 3 things about the book of Esther, you know this. It does not mention God. God is not a character. God is not referred to. The word God does not show up in the text. And there's people wonder if, because you have this written by this Jewish community living abroad, that maybe this sort of reflects a more secularized society in Persia before they return back. I'm going to stop there. Anything else you want to say about like the background to Esther?
So it's positioned here in our Bibles right after Ezra and Nehemiah because it's kind of close to the time frames that we've been reading about previously. In the Hebrew scriptures, this is not where it's located.
Right.
It's in with the festivals.
Yep.
Because this ultimately is tied to a Jewish spring festival, Purim.
Yes. Which is interesting because there's lots of discussion as to whether it's a chicken and egg scenario.
Right.
Did the book invent the festival of Purim, or did the festival of Purim then need a book to explain it? And there's one very interesting scholarly theory is that the people of this Jewish community living in Persian society were already celebrating a Persian or Babylonian spring festival. Mm-hmm. And we have these Jewish people who are doing that. Well, why are we celebrating this festival? It's not ours. Well, we're going to make it ours. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to give a Jewish origin story to this thing that we're already doing.
Yeah. I was noting that it's a little bit like, that explanation's a little bit like how we ended up with Christmas in December.
Yeah.
Because it got placed...
Jesus isn't born on December 25th?
Hate to break it to you, folks.
What?
Not likely.
No, we think he was actually born in the spring.
Yeah. Records, not so great back then.
No.
Especially not for poor people from Nazareth.
So how did we get December 25th? Why is it?
Well, right. So that's that was tied to a Roman festival celebrating the sun. And when I say the sun, I mean the big bright thing in the sky.
Yes.
Because there was kind of almost similar to, in Egypt, there was a sun god.
Yep.
The Romans connected their emperors to the sun and celebrated them. It celebrated the sun at this time of year when the sun is waning, interestingly. And since there was this going on already, the Christians said, well, we're going to keep our festival here. We're going to celebrate a sun, but a different type of sun.
The son
the
of
birth
God.
of an S-O-N as opposed to
an S-U-N.
An S-U-N. So tying that, and of course the S-O-N of our God, Jesus, is this son of God, the idea of the Roman emperor being kind of a, quote, son of their God, son, S-U-N God. Anyway, so I
they already had a party going on.
There's already a party going on,
and
we're just gonna
Christians are like, you can't say, hey y'all, you can't have your party anymore because no one wants to hear that.
Right.
So they say, hey y'all, you can still have your party. It's just now your party's about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so the theory is that yes, we can still have our party because now it's about this great story of Esther and Mordecai.
Yeah.
Right.
And triumph over Haman.
It's interesting. The faith hasn't changed, right? We're still celebrating God. We're still celebrating God's action in our lives, God's providence for us. And we'll kind of get into where God isn't spoken of here, but is perhaps underneath what's happening in the story. So the religion hasn't changed, but the trappings around the religion have with the addition of this festival. So, it's kind of the same thing as you see the community of faith develop, as they're pulled into exile, as they're brought home from exile, as the temple is built, as the temple falls. There's always this constant changing, shifting with the times, where the faith, the core of the faith isn't necessarily changing, but some of the trappings around it are changing, and a little bit of the thought process around it are shifting as they grow.
All religions develop,
Yep.
including our own.
Yeah.
Do we want to go through like the actual story of Esther before I go down a rabbit hole?
Yeah.
Quick
Does
recap.
your rabbit hole include that this is the only festival that is ordained by a woman?
No, but that's a good rabbit hole.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's the only Jewish festival ordained by a woman because ultimately it's kind of Esther and all of that what happens that leads to this celebration. The other festivals are ordained by God
Mostly through Moses.
Mostly through Moses.
Hanukkah through Judas Maccabee. But yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I like that. All right.
All right, so let's talk about the story itself. We're leaving it to you, Elliot, because you haven't really talked at all yet.
I don't got much to say about Esther. I'll be honest. Esther's an interesting book, but I can't say it's my favorite. But I think we've already said it takes place around the same period as Ezra and Nehemiah, when the Jews are in Persia after they've been taken into exile by the Babylonians, and we encounter this king of Persia who is probably Xerxes. Though here he's named as King. Pronounce it for us, Rick.
Well, it depends on your translation. Ahasuerus or Ahashverosh.
Right.
Whichever version you happen to be reading.
Yeah, Elliot and I both have trouble pronouncing this one.
Oh, yeah.
Which but is another borrowed word from Persian, because it's the Hebrew form of the old Persian name. Mm-hmm. And so if your Bible says Xerxes, it's not translating it from the Hebrew, it's translating it from the Greek.
Yep.
Xerxes, I can definitely say.
Yeah, Xerxes, I'm like, that's an easy one. Ahasuerus, yeah, that one doesn't roll off the tongue quite too easy. But he has this queen with a little bit of an easier name, Queen Vashti. She doesn't get a good telling in this story. She upsets her man.
I have to say, I think she's completely justified in her actions.
Well, I actually think that is an intentional form of narrative irony.
Yeah.
Yeah, you read it and you're like, okay, she didn't come at your absolute whim and beck and call.
Right. So the king and his dudes,
Yeah.
they are wildly trashed drunk.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
they want Vashti to show up and show off her beauty wearing her crown in front of them while they are smashed. And she's like, you know what? No, I don't want to do that.
I'm not doing this.
I'm not doing that right now.
And then so funny because they're like, all right, we'll show her and we'll show every woman in this entire empire, and we will make a law that every woman has to obey her husband, which I think there's the narrative irony, right? Like, this is coming from a story of you couldn't even make your wife obey you, and now you're saying every woman now has to obey their husband.
Only somebody who has no control over their woman, no respect from their woman, probably deservedly lacking of respect from their woman, has to then declare that this is the way that it is.
Absolutely.
It's like, that's like, I want to pat you on your head because you have such pain that you think you have to mandate this now.
Yeah.
Well, and there's such a great note in the Oxford Annotated Bible. In the notes about this section, the editor writes, "The fear of a feminine insurrection against the patriarchal order lies just below the surface of many ancient myths and legends, contrary to the king's eunuch's dire imaginings about what women might do. The real danger will come in the form of a conspiracy by palace bodyguards," in chapter 2. So there's again an irony here, right? Of this fear of women's disobedience and how it will upend order, and really the true fear, the true danger lies in these other men. But that's what we see begin to happen. There's a few other cast of characters. Mordecai, who is a Benjaminite, a Jew in Persia, and he has an adopted daughter named Esther. I think the other interesting thing about the Persian influences here is, at least my Bible notes, that these names have connections to Persian words and names. So Mordecai with the Persian god Marduk, and then Esther with the Persian goddess Ishtar. So that's interesting.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
No, I had to read this
until I
in
looked
the notes
at the
as well.
notes.
And Ishtar was the goddess of love and war, interestingly. And her Hebrew name, Haggadah, I believe I have that right, means myrtle.
That's what it says.
So that's a plant.
Yeah, and she has, what's interesting is it's saying here that she has both a Hebrew name, which is given in, this is chapter 2, verse 7. It talks about Mordecai had brought up Mine says Hadassah. That is Esther, his cousin.
Hadassah. Sorry, I had the wrong name.
No, that's okay. So yeah, again, an interesting note about the Persian influences. And also I think, whenever we see names that mean something a little more general, like a good example is Adam comes from the Hebrew for just human being. Yeah, Adamah, which is also connected to the Hebrew word for just earth and dirt, soil and dirt. I think a lot of times when this is happening, it does kind of alert us that this story is maybe not meant to be read as history in the sense of like objective historical reporting, which we've talked about so much in our podcasts.
Right.
In fact, again, one of the things the editor of Esther says in my Bible is that this really reads like a historical novella, that it's using historical timeframes and periods and events, but then kind of injecting this story into it.
Yeah, historical fiction.
Any other cast of characters? Haman, can't forget Haman, of course.
Haman's
my gosh.
the big
villain. Haman's the big bad.
And he's an Agagite.
Yep.
The notes point out the ways in which the story is referencing things that take place in Samuel, particularly regarding Saul.
Because Mordecai's a descendant of Saul. Haman would be a descendant of Saul's enemy.
Right.
The king
the
of
Amalekites.
Yeah.
So the idea, right. So Mordecai comes from the same tribe as Saul, is also a son of Kish. Saul's father was also named Kish. Interesting. Not that they're obviously it's not the same Kish, but there's those connections. And then that the Amalekites were the first enemy that the Jewish people had out of Egypt.
When they're coming across, they wouldn't allow them in.
Right.
And then the whole thing with Agag, I think, was the one that was the person that Saul wouldn't kill, that then Samuel had to kill.
What a callback.
Wow. Yeah, from 1 Samuel 15.
That was his downfall.
That was a big moment for Saul. So yeah, interesting connection to previous. Yeah. But again, it kind of alerts us that there are kind of novelistic tropes at work.
Yeah.
And one of the big issues is that Mordecai does not want to bow down to Haman when Haman passes through the king's gate.
Yeah.
And so backtrack before that, Esther, young, beautiful woman, according to the story, King Xerxes or Ahasuerus, here we go.
You got it.
Close enough.
That's good.
We need to do a phonetic pronunciation practice of that name. I'm just going to call him Xerxes from here on out because it's so much easier. He wants a new woman, and so he's looking for, as many men in the Bible do, young virgins. And Esther.
Beautiful young virgins.
Feels weird to even say this on a podcast.
Wow.
Esther fits the bill, and Mordecai's like, go do this.
And she's Jewish, but she does not disclose this.
No.
Right? She keeps that
it's in hiding
on the down low.
There was something I did note that there seemed like there was something about her more than just her beauty that stuck out for him. But I wondered if it was just her beauty, because she got special treatment from, like, Mordecai made sure that she was brought before one of the eunuchs. There's a lot of eunuchs in this. There's a lot of eunuchs dealing with, the king and the king's people. So Hegai, that must have been the name I mixed up with her.
One of the eunuchs.
Another name. So Hegai was one of the eunuchs, and Esther was particularly pleasing to Hegai in some way. And so Hegai really made sure that she was promoted and given all of the special treatment. And then when Esther was taken in to see the king, he loved her more than all the other women. And of all of them, she won his favor and devotion. It doesn't really give a good sense of, like, she was absolutely the most beautiful, but maybe there was something else to her. And right now, that's all she is just like a pretty face.
But
she develops.
Pretty quickly, Mordecai uncovers this conspiracy to kill the king. He tells Esther. And then Esther goes to the king and saves his life.
Right.
So she's hero.
Yep.
Right. Mordecai
hero.
Esther, hero because this was the other eunuchs at the king's gate who were conspiring to kill, as Elliot was mentioning before.
Yep. And then in the mix of this conspiracy, there is also Haman's plan to annihilate the Jews.
Yes.
Because Mordecai, as he finds all this out, he's hanging out at the king's gate. One of the things he won't do is bow down to Haman, who is King Xerxes' top advisor, the most important advisor. And so he develops this plan that the Jews need to be killed. And throughout all of this scheming, the reverse happens.
Part of the theme of Esther is this huge reversal.
Reversals.
Yes, lots of reversals.
You think the storyline, you think Mordecai is going to hang this comically large gallows. It's like 20 meters high or something like that.
Yeah.
That they're going to hang Mordecai from, and then whoop, like in a movie or at the end of a Gilbert and Sullivan opera, everything switches around, and Haman ends up on the gallows, this comically large gallows.
There's some interesting things there. First of all, there are comparisons here with the way that this is written literarily to kind of more modern comedy standards, right? Where things start with a banquet and a festival, and then there's a banquet and a festival at the end. Usually, like, for example, we've brought up Shakespeare before. In Shakespeare's comedies, there's a wedding at the end. In the tragedies, everybody dies. Interestingly, this kind of has some of both. There isn't a wedding at the end, but there's a big banquet and celebration at the end, and
everyone
a whole
dies.
bunch of people die. But yeah, there's the festivals and gatherings play a prominent role in here. It doesn't explain why Mordecai won't bow to Haman. I just assumed it had to do with the same sort of things about not bowing to anybody other than God.
Which is why it's strange it doesn't say that, right? Yeah. Like in the book of Daniel, where we think is, written somewhere around not long after this. We have Daniel, the Babylonians, saying that you must eat our diet, you must take our names, you must, become Babylonian and take all your Jewishness away. And Daniel's like, I will not do that, right? Like, I have a devotion to God and I will not do that.
In particular, it was bowing to the king in Daniel.
Right.
We're not to Daniel yet. Sorry. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. It's coming.
Is, a month or so, a couple months away.
But this would be a perfect place for Mordecai to have been lifted up as this incredibly faithful person who will not bow to a man, right? Because we only bow to God. But it doesn't say that.
Right.
No.
But it's also interesting the way that now twice in the story, something small, a personal slight, has become a big national crisis, right? Vashti simply not wanting to come in, flaunt in front of the drunk men, becomes a national crisis of all of the women need to be suppressed. Now, Haman, one guy, decides not to bow down to Haman. He's going to slaughter all of his people throughout the kingdom.
The entire nation. Right.
That's a great point.
It's a story of overreactions, right?
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Which goes to like sort of the comic
nature of it.
Right.
Yes.
This story is meant to delight, right?
Yeah.
It's meant to delight and inspire. It's like it's a national story, right? Like it's a story of our people, and our people almost got annihilated, but we didn't get annihilated. There was a plot against us, but we overcame the plot.
Yeah.
Not only did we overcome the plot, we reversed the plot. Everything was going to come on us. We put on them. Let's have a party.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's a pretty good summary.
Yeah.
That just about summarizes
And that's
it.
that.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week.
Well, yeah, no, it's funny the way that Haman is so full of himself. I mean, he even goes home the one time and tells his family how great he is and how he has all of this stuff.
Oh, gosh.
But he is so incredibly bothered by one guy who has slighted him. He has all these sons and all this wealth and all of the king's honor. But man, his ego is so incredibly fragile. If somebody makes fun of him just the tiniest bit or will not bow down to him, massive overreaction.
Yeah.
He's really comical in that way.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, come on, dude.
Yeah.
You're so full of yourself. He's further full of himself. There's a moment that's one of those maybe God did this moments.
Yes, there are a couple moments where you're like, are they trying to say God did this? They don't come out and say it, but like it's like could be there.
Right. So this is after the word has gone out that there's going to be this. Haman tricks the king really into putting out this edict that all of the Jews are going to be killed. There's a date and a time, and it was lots that were thrown to choose that date. And that's where you get the poor.
From Lot. Yeah.
Right, from Lot. So he picks this date and time. This edict goes out. Mordecai hears about it. He's all upset. He tells Esther and is trying to plead with her for help. In the meantime, the king has this And the king doesn't really know what's going on. He's like, oh, there's people who are against us, because Haman doesn't describe who exactly. He said, oh, there's these people, and they refuse to do what you say, so we have to kill them all. And the king's like, oh, you're right.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds
right,
good to me. If they aren't going to do it my way, I guess we have to get rid of them. Signs off on this. Haman's all excited, but then the king has this weird dream or can't sleep.
Yeah. Sort of like Pharaoh. Right, who wakes up with the dreams, yeah.
Right, and he goes, can you go back? He's like, I gotta go back to the archives. Mm-hmm. He goes and goes to the archives. They pull up the things, and he looks back a couple of weeks, and he realizes that Mordecai saved his life.
Yeah.
And he never honored him or said thanks. I was like, oh, wait, this guy saved my life. What did we do for him? So then he asks Haman for advice, like, what would you do for somebody who should be honored greatly? And Haman's like, oh, he must mean me.
Must mean me,
yeah,
right. Ah, big party, right?
Yeah, well, let me tell you what you
gifts.
should do.
Right.
And he goes through this whole thing, and of course, reversal. He has no idea that this is for his favorite person.
It really is like a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. I mean,
it's ridiculous. And then Haman, has to walk Mordecai around and honor him, and he goes home so humiliated.
Yeah. Well, it really is. It makes me think of Shakespeare plays where when you read them, you have this almost omniscient narrator view where you know that the character doesn't know.
Yes.
Like, even in Oedipus Rex, right? Like, you know what Oedipus is doing, and you're like, oh my gosh.
I
like,
can't believe
I can't believe this.
Right.
And you're just watching Haman, this bumbling fool. Doing.
Who doesn't know what
give
he
me the
doesn't
royal
know.
robe and give me the horse. And you're just like, oh man, this is comical.
Go get Mordecai,
Yep.
put it all on him. Good idea.
Good luck. There is a note as well, I think, speaking of moments where you mention when the king can't sleep at the start of chapter 6. There's another moment in chapter 4, I think, that some people point to as this is kind of one of the moments God is operating behind the scenes. And it's when Mordecai is talking to Esther and saying, okay, there's this plot to kill the Jews that Haman has concocted, and Mordecai is telling Esther that she needs to tell the king, but she says, I can't tell the king. I can't go in to see him for the next, X amount of days.
He hasn't called me in. You can only go see the king if he calls you, and he hasn't called me in 30 days.
Right.
Why hasn't she been called in 30 days if she's this gorgeous, awesome woman who he loves so much?
Left on read.
I know, absolutely left on red. And so Mordecai says to her, this is verse 14, or I'll start in 13. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. And then verse 14. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this.
For such a time as this. This
Yes.
is the
This is a
line of Esther.
Yep.
This is the line for a time such as this. And it's almost this belief in there's this providential moment that has been ordained for you to execute this protection for our people. I think an interesting note, just again, literarily and connections to the book of Samuel, which Natalee has already pointed out, is it notes that the phrase, who knows, ? When it's used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, often is used preceding a testament to divine providence. So David actually says this, if you remember, in 2 Samuel 12. This is after David's child with Bathsheba is killed by God. And I believe it's Nathan talking with David. Someone's talking with David. I can't remember who it is that's talking with David. But David has just learned the child's dead. And the servants say, why did you fast and weep while the child was alive, but once it died, you rose and ate food? And David in verse 22 says, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and the child may live. So again, it's this, at least what my notes are saying here, this is not an original thought of my own, is that this happens in biblical stories when there's hope for divine mercy. This phrase, who knows? Yeah. I'm actually thinking of my Muslim friends when they say, inshallah, this idea.
If God wills it.
Yeah, like this claim, like, well, if God wills it, this is what will come to be. So it sounds like the Hebrew, who knows, is kind of a similar thing, which is kind of cool. I'd never had heard that. But also people will point to that turn of phrase, from another quarter. and maybe think, oh, Mordecai is saying God will provide in some other way. So, but again, not explicitly.
Right. It's not explicit, but implicit.
No, implicit,
which might say something about the Persian Jewish community as it writes this. And maybe there's a fear of like being too religious and going against the grain, or maybe they're just a little more secular, and so they're thinking things a little more like behind the scenes.
Right.
But it is interesting that it's not.
Yeah. And one last comment I'll make about this is I was talking with the young, honorable Peter Stube about one of our priests here at St. David's about Esther, and asking him if he had any wisdom about Esther. And one of the things he said was that this book can feel so much more relevant to a modern reader, where I don't know about you, but not really going through life having like audible or physical interactions with God. Haven't stood before a lot of burning bushes, other than when Rick tells me to stop doing something stupid. I don't have a lot of prophets that are conveying the direct words of God for my life.
Daily, though. I mean, it's daily. So, come on.
Every once in a while. So this book really can feel like many of our lived lives, that there are these moments where the king can't sleep, or Mordecai says such a time as this, but it's happening in a much more implicit way than an explicit way.
That is interesting.
And I thought that was I thought that was a great way to think about this book.
There's wisdom to young Peter.
I know. It's like he's lived 75 years or something.
So it's interesting you bring up that moment, because this is where Esther starts to say, okay, I have a moment. I have some power here. She takes the risk of going in and seeing the king. She sends Mordecai off first to fast for 3 days, and she and her entourage also fast for 3 days. And that feels to me like it's a moment of checking in with God that felt, even though, again, it's not mentioned specifically, but it seemed kind of like the way that you would prepare in the prior sections of the Hebrew Bible. And then she goes and she stands before the king, and there's this thing with the scepter being held out, pointed at you, that allows you to, like, even you show up when you're not called, that you're given a pardon from showing up inappropriately. So she gets that, and she gets to go to him with her request. And he is so smitten by her that he just immediately wants to offer her anything she could possibly want to half of his kingdom.
Yep.
And this is one of those, again, literarily, he ends up doing this 3 times. So the first time is here, and she said, and all she asks for is that she wants to have a banquet and have he and Haman come to the banquet. So there's this lovely little banquet, and at that banquet, we think, okay, this is going to be the moment.
This is the moment.
But it's not. They have a lovely banquet. They have a great time. And then he's like, okay, what do you want? Anything to the half of my kingdom. She's like, you know what? I want you and Haman to come back to another banquet with me.
Party girl.
Another banquet, right? In the meantime, there's this whole thing where Haman's upset about, having to honor Mordecai. That happens in the intervening time. Haman continues to be upset about Mordecai. Gets some advice from his wife and family members to build the gallows and figure out how to get Mordecai specifically killed on them. Gets some bad advice. And then he has to rush off to the second banquet. And it is finally then at the second banquet that Esther's like, this is my moment.
What do you want?
And what do you want? Anything to the half of my kingdom. And she says, well, you all put out an edict to kill my people. And she reveals herself.
Yep.
As being Jewish, and that her people are going to be killed, and she wants this stopped. And the first thing that happens is that, and he says, well, who could have done that? And she's like, Haman! Right. And you can almost see her pointing at him, like the way that the scepter would have been pointed to her to pardon her. Now she's pointing at him to condemn him. And Xerxes can't handle it and has to walk out of the room for a minute.
Yeah, right.
And while he walks out of the room, Haman throws himself upon Esther to requesting mercy. And when Xerxes comes back in, he thinks that Haman is raping her or trying to. So now he's like, oh, now you're trying to one-up me as a man.
Yep.
And that's why he decides to have Haman killed.
Off with your head.
Off with your head. Not because you tried to kill all the Jews in the land, but because you tried to assault my wife.
Yep.
So she later has to again say, hey, Xerxes,
they're still killing everybody. All my people.
Yeah.
Can we?
Can we fix this thing up? So Haman is killed on the gallows, hung on the gallows, and in my notes it indicated that the gallows here, we're not talking about strung up by your neck, where like when presumably your neck is going to snap and it'll be a quick death. This is more impaled on a pole.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, that's great. In front of his home.
Yeah.
Because it's on the gallows that he had prepared, thinking Mordecai was going to be put on it. And so I'm feeling like, oh, that's pretty awful. So his wife and all of these sons get to see him hanging there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Special.
Interestingly, it says in the note for hanged on the gallows, literally in the Hebrew, on a tree. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. That's
foreshadowing.
Yeah, makes you scratch your head a little bit. Interestingly enough, no quotation of Esther in the New Testament at all, except, I shouldn't say at all, once, apparently, in Mark. I'll come back to this. Rick, you looked like you were about to say something, but I thought that was interesting, and I'll try and find that, and I'll come back to it if you give me a few minutes.
Well, are we ready for my rabbit hole?
I was just going to say, so the way that it ends up ending, the king puts out a new edict. He can't really actually reverse his original edict, but he puts out a different edict basically saying, well, on the day when everybody's supposed to kill the Jews, they can defend themselves. Mm-hmm. And again, act of God, kind of similarly as to what happens in the book of Joshua. They defeat all of the people who are coming after them. They, as a part of that, in the city of Susa, where most of this takes place, they kill all of his sons, hang them on the gallows as well. And then there's great rejoicing, and then they decide that they're going to have a new festival. Queen Esther declares this is a new festival to celebrate.
Festival of Purim.
Purim.
The lot.
The lot. That the role of the lot was that, this was a day, and we were successful. We get to live, and they killed off lots of people who stood against them.
Right.
There were big numbers of people that they killed.
Yeah.
In order to.
In that way, it's kind of like the Festival of Hanukkah. Well, and the Festival of Passover, now that I think about it. Like, wait a second. A lot of these festivals are celebrating.
We just defeated an unlikely enemy.
Yeah.
Like, we should not have won this. It's an unlikely victory.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, some unlikely victory.
That really is at the heart of a lot of the festivals.
Yeah, and so the thought that this is like implicitly religious. I mean, the unlikely victory over Pharaoh and the unlikely victory over the Greeks in Hanukkah were both considered to be acts of God.
Right.
And so here you have an unlikely victory. And so wouldn't they have seen that as an act of God too?
Right.
In a lot of these previous scriptures that we've read, God's always making it so that it is an unlikely victory, raising up somebody like David to defeat
a Goliath.
Goliath. And, you can only take a few people into this battle so that it'll be clear that I was the one who made sure that you. So that's kind of a repeating refrain, and that would have been in scriptures they would have been aware of as they're writing this, presumably.
Well, and the way
so it'd be a callback.
Yeah, the way they often go wrong is, and Rick talked about this in one of his sermons recently with the disciples, like, how did they not realize that God was going to do something with Jesus' resurrection? You talked about this in your Easter sermon.
Yeah.
But so much of the quote unquote sin in the Old Testament is when they deny that God will provide the victory and they try to find some human means to look for the victory. So that's connected to what we're saying, like so many of the things people do when God gets really upset with them. I did want to say the one seeming quotation of Esther in the New Testament comes from another kind of silly patriarchal male figure in the Gospels who is a ruler.
Herod.
Yeah, Herod. I was like, why is this ringing a bell about when Natalee, even the way Natalee said it about like,
I'll
even
give
under
you
the half of my kingdom. I was like, this is really ringing a bell.
Sounds familiar. Yeah.
This is exactly what Herod says, right?
He wants John the Baptist.
And this is when she asks for the head of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Foolishness.
So,
I mean, King Xerxes, we're going with Xerxes, is really kind of a fool in this himself.
He does not come off looking great.
No. I mean, he's
beholden
drunk,
to everybody.
His drunken stupor, everybody's pulling one over on him, from Haman to, in some ways, Esther. Just a fool, just a puppet in all of this.
Yep.
There's also some financial things. Haman was gonna bring money into the king's treasury from killing the Jews, I think from taking their plunder. And in the new edict that the king writes, he allows the Jews to take the plunder of the people that they kill, but they do not take the plunder.
Yes,
and
right.
again, that's another, that the notes reminded me that's another callback to Saul into that moment.
Do not
where
take what belongs to God. What is devoted.
Right, exactly.
So, that was really Saul's fundamental mistake, is taking the plunder.
Yeah.
But I know, Rick, you had a...
I'm dying.
Right, so it's
I'm dying over here.
You're squirming in your seat.
It's time to go down your rabbit hole. I think we've covered all the stuff we wanted to say.
So we talked about how this Esther does not mention God at all, right? God's not explicitly here. The word God does not show up at all in this version of Esther. However, there is another version of Esther.
What?
Well, yeah. So and we've talked around this a couple times in the podcast, and that is the Septuagint. So I want to just say a few things about the Septuagint, and then we'll go back to Esther. So the Septuagint is a ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. We think it's done around the 3rd century BC. Pharaoh Ptolemy wanted the Old Testament in the Library of Alexandria, but he wanted it in Greek. And so the legend around the Septuagint is that he found 72 scholars, and he put the 72 scholars each on their own little island and had them translate the Bible into Greek. And when they all came back off their little islands, they all had exactly the same translation. Like they all translated all the words exactly the same. And so it was seen, this legend is designed to show that the Septuagint is somehow like divinely appointed, right? It's not just a translation. This is it's an act of God. Sort of like the King James Bible, right? Is just...
Well, and it's probably worth saying that this is...
That's not a glowing...
I was hoping for...
not a big fan of the KJV.
Well, I mean, we've talked about it before. It was not one of the translations we really recommended reading.
No. Unfortunately, these legends don't tend to live up to the reality of...
No.
Which I know. But it's probably worth mentioning the background here is that much later after the Persians, we've talked about this series of big bads, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians. You get Alexander the Great, Macedonian, and he conquers all of the world, just like all these other people conquered all of the world. Yep. And that means the language of the day becomes Greek. And so that's part of why this needs to be done.
And Jews specifically living in what's called diaspora, so living not in Jerusalem or in Judah, Israel, they're living in other places. They definitely spoke Greek.
Yep.
And so the Jewish communities living in diaspora in Egypt needed a version of the scriptures that they could read.
Right.
And so that's probably more the actual genesis of where the Septuagint comes from.
Right. And then with the New Testament, remember, because that's written during this period, written in Greek, not in Hebrew. There's a little bit of Aramaic. And then also when the authors of the New Testament are quoting or citing the Old Testament.
This is huge.
They're taking it from the Septuagint. And
almost every quotation of the Old Testament in the New Testament is directly from the Septuagint.
Yeah. So the Septuagint is very important. And there are also differences between Hebrew manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint.
Yeah, which is how we can tell that the New Testament authors are using the Septuagint,
right?
Because it is very obvious they're using the choices that the Greek translators used instead of the Hebrew text. Most of the time, when we think about the Old Testament, we think about it being written in Hebrew and what we call the Masoretic text. But when Paul, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, others are quoting the Old Testament, they do not quote from the Hebrew; they quote from the Greek. And so,
why would that have been? Is it because the Septuagint would have been the one that was available to them at that, or they didn't have the knowledge of the language to use the Hebrew?
It was more of a common language at that point.
So it's just so that when they wrote and out to people, translation was the one that would make the most sense.
What we call the Greek from the New Testament is called Koine Greek, and it just means common or street. Like it's the language of the streets. Yeah. And so the Septuagint was in the same vein. You know, it's what the kids on the streets were talking, and so we got to get the word out there.
It was like when the masses in the Catholic Church went from Latin to the language of the people.
Right. And Latin, when Jerome translates the Bible into Latin, it's called the Vulgate because it was the vulgar language. It was the common language.
The people's language.
We think about Latin as being like highfalutin and ceremonial. No. Back then, it was just the common language. So anyway, this Septuagint, super important for Christians, super important to understand the New Testament and how it deals with the Old Testament. And the Septuagint has extra books that don't make it into most Protestant Bibles, and this becomes what's known as the Apocrypha. And so you guys have in front of you
we have study Bibles
that have the Old New Testament with Apocrypha. And so you guys have the English translations of these books that come out of the Septuagint. Septuagint has an extra psalm. There's a 151st Psalm. It has some books like Maccabees and the Wisdom of Solomon. But it also has, and here's where we come back to Esther, it has additions to the book of Esther. There are 6 major additions where the book of Esther is just longer. And in these additions, not only do we have the mention of God over and over and over again, but we see Mordecai and Esther as these deeply faithful people who are praying. And so in Esther chapter 4, in the middle of Esther chapter 4, after verse 17, there's this huge addition, which is the prayer of Mordecai. Just started out, it says, "And he besought the Lord, making mention of all the works of the Lord. And he said, Lord God, King ruling over all, for all things are in your power, and there is no one that shall oppose you in your purpose to save Israel." Right? It sounds more like the Old Testament that we're used to hearing and not Esther. In the beginning of chapter 5, we have the long prayer of Esther herself. And so I'll read a little portion of that. "And she besought the Lord God of Israel and said, O my Lord, thou alone art our king. Help me, who am destitute and have no helper but you, for my danger is near at hand. I have heard from my birth in the tribe of my kindred that thou, Lord, tookest Israel out of all the nations and our fathers out of all their kindred for a perpetual inheritance." It sounds like it's right out of the Deuteronomistic historian or the chronicler. It's talking about God. You had done all of these things for us in ages past, and so we need you to do something for us today. We think that these additions were not written in ancient Persia and just got lost, right, but that they were added by this Egyptian community, Greek-speaking community of Jews in Egypt, and reflecting the theology of their time. And so they've added some things in. And whereas we question as whether the community living in Persia was maybe a little more secularized, maybe we're not going to speak of God as openly. In Egypt, the Jewish community is a lot more explicit in its faith, and maybe was a little uncomfortable with this book that doesn't mention God directly. And so we have to, I think Esther was a praying woman. And so I think she prayed. And so here's what her prayer would have sounded like. So if you're not a fan of Esther as it stands, you might want to pick up a version of the Apocrypha and just see if you like it a little more. Elliot, you were saying it before we went live about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, so this is also interesting because the oldest. So remember, we have this Bible. We're reading it in English. When it is translated into English, scholars are taking critical editions of the Hebrew and the Greek.
What's a critical edition?
It's the edition. Well, one, it's going to be written in Hebrew or Greek, right? And that the sense is that these are scholarly apparatuses that from archaeology that have discovered manuscripts, Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, They have done all of the work of, you might find a manuscript with 1 page of Esther. You might find a manuscript with 10 pages of Esther. You might find one with all of Esther. And then they're trying to date them, and they're trying to
trying to find go back to the source and get as close as they can to the original as possible.
Exactly. Right. Like based on age, based on the number of manuscripts attesting a certain sentence, a certain word, here is what we think in this scholarly critical apparatus was what the original work would have said.
Yeah.
That's not a perfect science, but it is a science.
Yeah, definitely.
And we can, like, if you're listening to this right now, you don't have to be worried of like, do we even know what any of these things say? Like, we can with pretty good certainty say that this is what these original works say. So that's a bit of a breakdown of how you get your English Bible. But part of what you have to understand is where we get some of these manuscripts. So for the Old Testament, what is very interesting is there was a discovery in the 1940s in caves in Israel called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these are found in these Qumran caves, which we think there was this community of Jews, more sectarian Jews, the Essenes.
Deeply religious. We think they were really against the sort of standard Jewish practices at the time, and they were doing their own thing out in the woods.
And so we found thousands and thousands and thousands of Hebrew documents. And interestingly enough, Esther is the only book in the Hebrew Bible not found in these Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls. And so what's really interesting is like on one of these podcasts, right, we'll talk about how like, the original name for the book of Genesis wasn't Genesis. A lot of times when we have a name for a book in the Hebrew Bible, it comes from actually the Septuagint.
Yep.
And a lot of times we've mentioned that the Hebrew name for the book would have been like the first word in the book. And we're going to see that a lot of times attested in the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls. But so it's interesting. This is just a very nerdy point. With Esther, it's kind of an open question of like, I wonder what the title for Esther would have been before the Septuagint. But it's just a good example of how this history comes to us today.
And it's super important because the Bible that you are holding in your hand, no matter what Bible, unless it's the King James, the Bible you are holding in your hand was directly impacted by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mm-hmm. It totally changed biblical scholarship forever because all of a sudden we have these older documents that we can go back to that are closer to we do not have any originals from any book of the Bible. Yes. Not a single thing.
And the reason why is because we have to remember in the ancient world, manuscripts were not just written once and it was like, okay, now we have it. They would write hundreds and thousands of manuscripts because manuscripts degraded. Yep. And then also to transmit it, couldn't just, upload it online like Natalee does for us here at St. David's.
Yeah.
This is well before Gutenberg and his printing press.
Yep.
And it's also one of the reasons why we don't recommend the King James Version.
Yes.
Because the manuscripts it was based on are much newer.
Yes.
Because more modern Bibles are based on much older, closer to the original versions, including the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah. The other, it's a long time since I've thought about this. The other thing you have to consider, this is just my knock on the KJV, is when manuscripts were transmitted, there becomes local streams of manuscript traditions, you could say, right? So like, I'm pulling this out of the back of my brain, so I can't really remember. There's like the Alexandrian manuscripts, and then there's the, just make up another city.
There's Codex Vaticanus.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so part of what can go wrong is if there is a manuscript tradition that we realize now there were errors in it. Well, when they made
copies of copies, that error just keeps going straight through.
Exactly.
So if you can find a stream of that same document that's before the error was
earlier,
made, now all of a sudden you're closer to what
then the person
actually was saying.
And a lot of times you can see how the error was made. And when we're talking about errors, we're not talking about some like giant thing. It's like
little words,
a word or a letter, and it affects it. But this is why the KJV is problematic, because when the KJV was written in, the 16th century, 15th century, they didn't have access. Archaeology didn't exist at that point. We hadn't discovered things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and these more ancient Greek manuscripts. And so it's unfortunately a little bit worse in terms of the manuscript tradition that's been used. That's the kind of very basic. You can go online, look it up, read about it, peruse Wikipedia.
I remember.
Find a library.
Find a library.
I remember as a kid.
The public library. is a fantastic place to go.
It is.
There's lots of resources available to you for free.
When I was a kid, the Dead Sea Scrolls came to Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And my family, we drove down and went and saw the Dead Sea Scrolls there. And,
No kidding.
Wow.
And what I've always said is like all my friends were going to see the Grateful Dead. I was going to see the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's
way cooler.
That's
way cooler.
That's my childhood, sort of in a
so
nugget.
much.
I know, it does. It
so
explains
much.
so much. That's great.
Yeah, I'm a
really
deadhead.
does.
It's just not that kind of deadhead.
Yeah, we should get you a t-shirt that says Deadhead and it's a picture of scrolls. That would actually be hilarious. There'd be like 2 people on Earth that get that.
Another idea for our merch.
And they're both in this room.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know. Man, and we haven't even talked about the Masoretic text, which is another. We were talking about this before we started recording.
This all has so much to do with Esther.
No, it has. Well, I mean, it does. It has to do with the history.
The
history of it, but
Septuagint,
not much. The Masoretic text.
The history of the historical fiction that this story is.
Yeah, the Masoretic text is interesting because before we got on, I was talking about how the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls are really important because it's like the foundation of our Hebrew Bible, which is like it attests to what we have in the Hebrew Bible, but really where the Hebrew Bible comes from is from this community of Jews that devoted themselves to copying the scriptures in Hebrew, the Masoretes, which now we have this Hebrew Bible that we call the Masoretic text. And so the Masoretic text is like the Hebrew that we can kind of look at as what the Septuagint would have kind of been based on, basically. But it actually, complicatedly, this takes place after the Septuagint. This takes place around the 6th century CE.
Yeah.
So Natalie's looking at me with like wide eyes of like, this is just so nerdy and like, what does this have to do with anything?
I'm trying to remember if we talked about the lovely treats that go with Purim because this is where I'm like.
Before we get to the lovely treats, we should talk about treats, but just going back a little bit to the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not contain Esther. Is it because we didn't find that jar? Like, did they have it, but it just got lost? Or the Qumran community, deeply religious. They fasted all the time. We think maybe John the Baptist was from Qumran because he's out there wearing all the the camel's hair and eating locusts and wild honey and all that. He seems like a kind of extreme kind of guy, like the Qumran community. Did they not like the subtle spirituality of Esther, and so
it wasn't overt enough,
right? So did they just like leave it out? And I think that's an open question.
Yeah, I mean, I think even when I was reading the introduction in the Oxford Annotated Bible, which I just can't recommend these introductions enough, they're so helpful.
Yeah,
it talks about how this really was a very contested book. Even, beyond this point in rabbinical Judaism, like it was really contested. Should it be part of our Bible or not? In some ways, it's very similar to how Protestants, I think, have argued about the book of James in the New Testament.
Or Revelation.
Where we'll find throughout our canon, there were really big arguments around some of these books. I think we forget that.
Yep.
That there were people that were like, we don't consider this scripture. This isn't scripture for us.
Yep.
There's an unexplained line here in the notes, the pre-Esther notes, that says, not until the 3rd century CE was Esther fully accepted into the Jewish canon of Scripture, and the Protestant reformer Martin Luther wished it had never been written. I'm like, well, now I'm gonna have to find out now. Why did Martin Luther not want this? Wish that it had never been written. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I've never
Apparently
heard
Martin
that.
Luther didn't like
That's
Esther.
so interesting because he was like super against the book of James. He called it the Epistle of Straw. I did not know that about Esther.
I didn't either.
That's what these folks say. So
it's also fascinating because Natalee has the 3rd edition of the Oxford Annotated Bible. I have the 5th edition.
Is that
so
noted
sometimes
there or
we can
not?
have different notes. Mine doesn't include anything about that. Yeah, which I think
maybe. Well, mine is
part of it
older. Then maybe mine is the King James version of the.
Well, part of it is with the new edition, they got new editors. So does
Yeah.
it say who yours is written by? The name of the person? Usually, it's at the end.
Like at the very end of the notes? No, it doesn't have the name of the person who wrote that note.
So maybe it was like written by committee. This is like so off topic from Esther.
Oh man.
My Oxford Annotated Bible, each book has an editor.
Yeah.
And so this one is written by someone, I'm sure if you look her up, she's a scholar, Mary Joan Wynne Leith. So when
maybe that wasn't an important or interesting point to her.
Yeah, which doesn't mean what you're saying was not
or
true.
Or she's really into Luther, and so she didn't want to throw Luther under the bus.
She's a Lutheran. She was like, oh, I can't talk about Luther saying this.
Oh, that's a good point too. Well, okay, so all of this to say, once again, and we have said this over and over, this is why the concept of biblical inerrancy is very difficult.
Yeah.
Because here we are talking about things that were included or not included, or how far
which
back
version?
do they go, which version.
Yep.
Who added what?
Did they have the Dead Sea Scrolls? What was it written, what
Get this
language
book out
had it
of
been
here.
written in? How many times did it translated and copied over? And did some region include some things and the other region didn't include other things? And it's tricky. Reading the Bible is tricky. There's so many other things to take in mind. If you don't have a study Bible, you don't get all these other great notes about what's going on with these. And you may not make immediately those connections to what was going on. This is why it's really important. You can read the Bible on your own, but reading the Bible in community and reading the Bible with
us, honestly.
Reading the Bible with us here on the Cross Connections podcast is absolutely the best
necessary.
way to do it. But reading the Bible all by yourself you can do that.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Go ahead.
But you're going to miss some things.
But you're going to miss some things.
Yeah.
Because in the end, all of this is intended for community.
Yeah.
It's written to community. It's written for community. It's intended to be discussed in community, wrestled with in community, lived in community.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I just have to say, I'm sorry to say this after Natalee's wonderful and eloquent comments, to share some nasty comments. I had to look up Luther's comments on the Book of Esther.
Oh, let's hear
good.
it.
And if anyone knows anything about Luther, he could be
very subtle.
Yeah.
He's subtle.
Yeah, no, he's he did
understated.
not hold back.
Understated.
He never was known for his strong emotions, especially around Judaism. Not at all. And
yikes.
Luther has a very complex relationship with Judaism and just hot takes in general.
Yeah.
I was actually just telling someone the other day, there's a website called Lutheran Insult Generator, and it will literally you can look it up right now. It will not create something. This isn't like AI. It will just randomly give you a quote from Luther's works of just vitriolic insult, because Luther was well known as a writer for just debasing and absolutely going in on people in his letters.
Oh, wow. You get those Shakespeare insult
Oh
generator
my gosh.
things. Those are fun too.
They're amazing.
I think we should end
Luther
our episode
had quite a way.
with
I think each of us should
give one.
Give our generated Luther take.
Well, let me tell you what he said about Esther.
Okay.
And he also says this about 2 Maccabees, which is, I think, where you read about the events that precipitate Hanukkah. And this is what Luther says in one of his table talks. I am so great an enemy to the second book of the Maccabees and to Esther that I wish they had not come to us at all, for they have too much heathen unnaturalities. The Jews much more esteemed the book of Esther than any of the prophets.
What?
Wow.
Yeah, very
Wow.
interesting. Luther's a upset guy about Esther. I had never heard that.
But
so thanks to Natalee
I wonder if that's because he's reading the Protestant version and not the Septuagint version. And had he seen the faith of Mordecai and Esther that is alive in the Septuagint, he might have had a different take on it.
Yeah,
Maybe. But it sounds like he has some other issues there. In terms of, I wonder if they're tied to the festival practices. Did people, I don't know what the festival practices of the Jewish people of the time that Martin Luther lived were.
Right.
But just kind of the phrasing of that made me wonder if people were really into celebrating Purim. And they celebrated Passover, but somehow it wasn't as big a deal. I don't know. That's just kind of the impression it makes me wonder and want to dig deeper as to what was going on.
I find that curious because I would, just looking at pictures of Martin Luther, I think he would have enjoyed pastries.
Yeah.
And
Especially pastries in the shape of a little triangular pocket or a hat.
Triangular pastries that were known as Haman hats.
Hamantaschen, they are so delicious.
Man, we should have had some.
Well, if you know anything about Luther's biography, maybe he wouldn't have enjoyed pastries because Luther had a tough time on the toilet.
Well, I think he needs to play. That might be.
We are in wild waters on this podcast,
wow.
but
And this is our take on Esther.
Here's a real rabbit hole. If you want to go read something really fascinating, there is a basically psychoanalytic historian, Erik Erikson, and he wrote a book on Luther, which he wrote. The book is called. Let me look it up, but I'll tell you that in that book, he basically roots the Protestant Reformation that begins with Luther.
Yeah.
In Luther's digestional issues, that all of this time Luther spent ruminating on the toilet. He was ruminating as a monk with all of these issues and anxieties, and that is crazy. Isn't that fascinating? That book, for anyone that wants to look it up, is called Young Man Luther. It's a very infamous book. And Erikson, a well-known, well-respected.
Erikson.
Yeah. So, but I'm thinking of this right now because I had a Lutheran New Testament professor that hated that book. He couldn't say enough bad about that book because he thought it was very insulting to say like, oh, this is where it all began, is Luther on the toilet.
Maybe Katharina von Bora wasn't much of a cook. She seemed like she was very involved in some other things, and maybe dinner was not particularly full of vegetables.
Haman hats were not
no Haman hats.
Okay, that was one of the things I wanted to mention.
Should we finish with
the Haman hats, the hamantaschen, which are traditional Purim treat. And I recalled, having been invited to a Purim party that I did not get a chance to attend, that there were costumes involved in Purim celebrations.
Yeah.
So, and I remember thinking at the time, costumes, and I didn't ask the question then, but I looked it up on Wikipedia just earlier because I realized that I'd forgotten about that part. There were a couple of explanations, either that the reason for costumes was tied to the fact that God is hidden in this story. I wondered if it was because the Jewishness had been hidden, kind of like, masquerade-like.
Yeah.
But it did seem that is a much later addition to the celebrations of Purim. It's a much more
right. You
modern.
said 15th century in Italy.
Yeah, that's what Wikipedia had to say.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. Connected to, I read how Purim became very connected to Carnival a little bit. Very, very similar like connection.
Yeah.
Should we finish with a Lutheran insult? Do you each have
okay. Lutheran insult generators.
All right. Here's the one I came up with. It's ergofabulous.org. Ergo fabulous. Yep. Heaven and earth are in danger of caving in because of your heresies.
Yeah, people said that to my college papers. That was the notes professors left. I'm sure you've gotten this one before, Rick.
Yeah.
You are such a coward that you try to catch every word and evaluate it like a man who tries to trap the wind in his coat.
Wow. Every Sunday at the back door of church.
Yeah, vestry members.
Every Sunday at the back door of church.
Do you not see here the devil, the enemy of God's order?
Oh, wow.
That is really funny that's the one I got, because
I love that.
If you know the Enneagram, I'm a type 1 and order is all.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, no, really?
God's trying to tell you something.
Oh, goodness, I hit the insult me again. Are you not making an elephant out of a fly? What wonder workers.
Wow.
That is pretty much the description of this podcast.
Yeah, that is. What wonder workers.
I think an elephant out of a fly accurately describes both King Xerxes' overreaction to Vashti and Haman's overreaction to Mordecai.
Wow.
You have brought it. That. Drop the mic.
End the episode.
Done.
Yep.
See you next time.
That's a wrap.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484 588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.
Wow, I didn't think we'd ever come back to Esther.
Well, I hit the insult me again, and who knew? It was a work of God.